정상 속도보다 빠르게 혹은 정상 속도보다 아주 느리게 들어보면 그 내용을 파악하기는 쉽지 않지만 오히려 그 언어의 고유한 억양과 소리에 더 예민해지기 때문에 더 쉽게 익숙해질 수도 있다고 하네요. 억지로 해석하지 말고 한번 편안하게 소리에 집중해 보시기 바랍니다.
After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective.
복잡한 문법이 아니라 간단한 원칙으로 영어 문장의 구조와 의미를 간단하게 파악하는 데 집중해서요. 영어 문장 구조가 결국에 이런 거구나 라고 느낄 수 있도록 연습해 봅니다. 자, 구조를 보기 위해서 동사를 먼저 살펴볼게요. 동사는 역시나 간단합니다. came이라는 뿌리 동사가 나왔고요. 뒤에 need, 그 다음 비동사 is. 자, 그러니까 문장의 골격은 간단하네요. I came to the conclusion that 이하의 결론에 도달했습니다 라는 거고요. 그 결론이 이러이러한 거라는 건데요. 골격은 간단한데 문장이 이렇게 길어진 이유는 전명구 때문입니다. 전치사 다음에 명사, 전치사 다음에 명사, 전치사 다음에 명사, 전치사 다음에 명사. 이러한 전명구들이 문장을 길어지게 만들고 있죠. 전명구는 보통 형용사나 부사구 역할을 해서 골격에는 큰 영향을 주지 않아요. 일단 골격만 살펴본다면 I came to the conclusion that 이하의 결론에 도달했는데요. 어떤 결론이냐면요. What we need in education is 자, 바로 이러한 문장 구조를 잘 볼 수 있어야 되죠. 앞에서도 벌써 한 2번 나왔어요. 이 동일한 구조가요. need란 동사가 뿌리 동사가 아니죠. need 다음에 목적어가 안 보입니다. 목적어 어디냐면 앞에 있어요. 그래서 우리가 필요합니다가 아니고요. 우리가 필요한 것. 우리가 필요한 것. 그러니까 we need in education. 교육에서 우리가 필요한 것은 understanding. 이해가 필요하다는 거예요. A much better understanding. 훨씬 더 나은 이해가 필요하다. 우리가 교육에서 훨씬 더 나은 이해를 가질 필요가 있다. 무엇에 대한 이해가 필요하다는 걸까요? 이제 그 부분을 뒤에 설명해 주겠죠? Of students and learning. 자, 전명구로 왔고요. 전치사 of를 꼭 소유격으로 해석하실 필요는 없습니다. 소유격 뭐뭐의 이렇게 해석하면 해석이 잘 안 될 때가 많죠. 저희가 강의나 책에서 말씀드린 것처럼 전치사 of가 가장 전치사다운 전치사예요. 뭐뭐과 관련된 이라는 의미로 해석하시면 됩니다. 해석이 잘 안 될 때는 이것과 관련된 학생들 그리고 학습과 관련된 훨씬 더 나은 이해 그게 필요하다. 자, 우리가 학생과 배우는 학생과 배우는 그 자체 학습에 대해서 좀 더 이해를 깊이 해야 된다는 건데요. 어떤 관점에서요? From a motivational perspective. 동기부여라는 관점에서. 그리고 from a psychological perspective. 심리적인 관점에서 학생과 학습에 대한 훨씬 더 나은 이해가 필요하다.
After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective.
하루에 짧게 일부분만 집중해서 공부를 하고 대신에 매일 하루에 한 번씩 전체를 처음부터 끝까지 다 들어보고 다음 날에 이어서 일부분을 다시 집중해서 공부를 하고 영상 전체를 다 들어보고 자 이렇게 영상 하나를 다 보고 나면 뭔가 달라지겠죠? 자 일부분을 집중해서 공부를 해봤으니까요. 이제 전체 영상을 한번 편안하게 들어보세요.
When I was 27 years old, I left a very demanding job in management consulting for a job that was even more demanding, teaching. I went to teach 7th graders math in the New York City public schools. And like any teacher, I made quizzes and tests, I gave out homework assignments. When the work came back, I calculated grades. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. The kinds of things you need to learn in 7th grade math, sure, they're hard. Ratios, decimals, the area of a parallelogram. But these concepts are not impossible. And I was firmly convinced that every one of my students could learn the material if they worked hard and long enough. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. In education, the one thing we know how to measure best is IQ. But what if doing well in school and in life depends on much more than your ability to learn quickly and easily? So I left the classroom and I went to graduate school to become a psychologist. I started studying kids and adults in all kinds of super challenging settings. And in every study, my question was, who is successful here and why? My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies, asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future, day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. A few years ago, I started studying grit in the Chicago public schools. I asked thousands of high school juniors to take grit questionnaires, and then waited around more than a year to see who would graduate. Turns out that grittier kids were significantly more likely to graduate, even when I matched them on every characteristic I could measure, things like family income, standardized achievement test scores, even how safe kids felt when they were at school. So it's not just at West Point or the National Spelling Bee that grit matters, it's also in school, especially for kids at risk for dropping out. To me, the most shocking thing about grit is how little we know, how little science knows about building it. Every day, parents and teachers ask me, how do I build grit in kids? What do I do to teach kids a solid work ethic? How do I keep them motivated for the long run? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that talent doesn't make you gritty. Our data show very clearly that there are many talented individuals who simply do not follow through on their commitments. In fact, in our data, grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. So far, the best idea I've heard about building grit in kids is something called growth mindset. This is an idea developed at Stanford University by Carol Dweck, and it is the belief that the ability to learn is not fixed, that it can change with your effort. Dr. Dweck has shown that when kids read and learn about the brain and how it changes and grows in response to challenge, they're much more likely to persevere when they fail because they don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. So growth mindset is a great idea for building grit, but we need more. And that's where I'm going to end my remarks, because that's where we are. That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
영어 문장 속에서 동사가 등장할 수 있는 방법은 딱 세 가지밖에 없습니다. 뿌리거나, 뿌리가 아니면 변신 혹은 숨어서 나오는 거죠.